Okay, let's get going. I got a little bit behind. It's not the kind of behind you want to get. So let's move forward. So our next paper is the squat EMG paper by Yavuz, published in J-Sport Side 2015. Primary reviewer was John Patrizio. There are your categories: biomechanics, biomechanical squatology, electromyography, and training, coaching, performance. So, as you may be aware, controversy exists about what are the relative utilities of the different squat variants. In other words, how should we be squatting? What kind of squat should we be doing? And some of this controversy is sincere and well-meaning and based on a genuine ignorance of the issues involved. And of course, some of it is not sincere, right? Some of it is just, as Alfred the Great once said to Batman, some men just want to see the world burn, right? And this paper is not for them. We're not going to convince those people, right? Actually, this paper is not going to convince anybody of anything. This paper we are presenting because it needs to be destroyed. The authors aimed to compare the muscular activity measured by surface EMG and kinematics of the knee and hip during front and back squats with maximal loading. Front and back squats with maximal loading. So, here's what they did. They took a dozen college-age bros who were experienced in the front and back squat. So, the men had a mean back squat of 242 pounds and a mean front squat of 187 pounds. So how frickin' experienced could they be? They took these guys in the lab, they put the shiny stickers all over them, right, to measure their video kinematic data, and they did EMG of all these wonderful muscles here that you see, right? Surface EMG measurements of all these wonderful muscles. Basically, the quads, the hams, the butt, and the erector spinae. Okay. Anybody notice anything missing here? Adductors? Yeah. Okay. The bros came in for 2 sessions. One was for one rep max testing of their huge front and back squats, and one was for data collection. Both the front squats and the back squats were performed to what the authors called the minimum knee angle, quote, approximately 90 degrees. Now, I don't know about you, maybe your squat technique varies from mine, but at the bottom of the squat, the minimum knee angle should not be 90 degrees. And the authors should have known better, as I will show you presently. But they also say that in the back squat, the thighs are parallel to the floor. Now, how the hell does that happen at a knee angle of 90 degrees? And they say that the descending and ascending motions of the front squat are much the same as the back squat. But they also say that they used stoppers to set the knee angle for the front squat and the back squat at 90 degrees. Stoppers. They use stoppers in the rack to make sure that they fix the knee angle at 90 degrees for this front squat and the back squat. So, I'm confused. I don't know what the hell is going on here. I just don't, right? It made my head hurt to read it. But that's okay, because the authors give us an exemplar. Just feast your eyes on that. I hope everyone can see that. Probably can't. Here's the back squat. As you can see, it's a high bar back squat, right? Here's the front squat. Elbows like this, right? Toes forward in both of them, and yet it's 90 degrees. It's 90 degrees. There's no parallel to the floor here.
Frame 3 at the bottom over there.
Huh?
Frame 3 is a 90-degree knee.
Depending on where you measure it, yeah, he's not below parallel. He's not even at parallel. And this is, I don't know. It's at an angle. This one here is definitely a, hey. They're not in the rack with stoppers here. The authors tell us that they use stoppers to fix the knee angle at 90 degrees. Rip, 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 rip. Get out of my presentation. We're moving forward. So here are the results. No difference in knee angles between the front squats and the back squats were observed. And the hip angle in the back squat was more acute. And I didn't, somehow it disappeared from here, but the surface EMG activities for both movements were essentially the same. They were essentially the same, right? The front squat turned out to use a little bit more quad, and the back squat turned out to use a little bit more hamstring. But overall, muscle activity as measured by surface EMG, essentially the same. Knee angle the same, and it turns out that when you back squat, you lean over a little bit more. So those are the results. So now, this is important because you got to know that people are going to seize on this paper. You have to know that, right? So here are the author's conclusions, and I quote, "The front squat was shown to be just as effective as the back squat under maximum loading conditions in terms of overall muscle activity, with no difference in knee joint kinematics and significantly less forward lean in the hip joint, which may probably show less lumbar injury risk." No, that was me. But may probably was their contribution to the literature. Now, I would submit to you that we could look at the same data and come up with a slightly differently worded conclusion, right? That would be just as meaningless. Okay, so we've all had a good laugh here, but it deserves a critical review. Why? Because the bro scientists and the brofessors will be all over this, like ugly on an ape. And I'll tell you who else will be all over it. The people who want to regulate our industry will be all over this. I'm reading this paper and I'm having visions of us trying to explain to a board of physical therapy or a politician, why we're prescribing low bar back squats, and then some idiot state senator waves a paper around and says, but it's been scientifically shown that front squats are just as good for you, they cause just as much muscle activation, and they're safer for your back. Because that's what people will take away from this. So, the EMG data showed similar magnitude of muscle activation between the two exercises, but both exercises were performed at maximum weight. So why would you expect it to be any different? Why would you, CJ, can you help me out here? Why would you expect not to see the same? I mean, they both had maximum muscle activation because the bros were lifting as much weight as they could lift in both the exercise variants. They were both performed at limit weight and incorrectly. There was no difference in the knee angle between the two movements. And this is actual data from the study. What they were trying to do is show the force development along with the knee angle. I'm just showing it to you the knee angle. These are the actual kinematically measured knee angles, Rip, that they actually measured during the study. 90 degrees. 90 degrees. The knee angles were the same for both movements. But they used stoppers to fix the knee angles for both movements at 90 degrees. In other words, these guys show that when you restrict the knee angle to 90 degrees for both movements have a knee angle of 90 degrees. They used the squat to prove the reflexive property of mathematics, that 90 degrees equals 90 degrees. Unbelievable. This picture is actually used in the article, Rip, by permission. They said, okay, used by permission of the Asgard company.
I don't remember giving.
So this is what they use as sort of their theoretical model foundation for this whole thing, right? They didn't actually do the exercises this way, but then they're shocked to report to us that the knee angle between the two squat variants is actually the same, and that you bend over a little bit more when you do a back squat. The other thing that I take away from their use of this image is that this is not the complete image from the book, is it? In the book, there is another part of this image that shows a low bar back squat where there's a significant kinematic difference between the variants. But they didn't bother to look at that. They didn't bother to talk about it. The whole purpose of this image was to show us how much more similar the high bar back squat is to the front squat than the low bar back squat. And they observed some kinematic similarities between the two, the main difference being that you lean forward a little bit more with the back squat. And that's important, they think, because obviously if you lean forward while you're squatting, you're going to shear your back right in half. Lower risk of injury for the front squat. There is absolutely nothing in this paper that can possibly support that conclusion, which the authors make, that the front squat will be safer for your back. That conclusion is completely unsupportable not only by their own data, but by any other data anywhere in the literature. And it's completely at odds with the state-of-the-art data that's been presented by Hartman. And finally, is EMG activity a clinically relevant outcome? Right, who logs their EMG activity after a workout? Anybody? Brett Contreras, that's right. No. Strength is a clinically important outcome. It's a clinically relevant outcome. And this study also showed that people were able to lift more weight with a back squat, even a high bar back squat, than a front squat. And it just doesn't seem to occur to them that that is the clinically relevant outcome for the selection of a squat variant. Now you mark my words, this paper will be waved in our faces at some point in time as proof that back squatting is not any more effective for training than the front squat and safer for your back. You need to be familiar with it, and you need to be able to do this same deconstruction yourself when somebody waves it in front of you.
So what journal is this fucking thing in?
What was it? Journal of Sports Science. Thank you. Wrong outcome measures, wrong methodology, wrong performance of the exercise. The most we can possibly take from it is that poorly performed front squats are more quad dominant and poorly performed back squats are more ham dominant. So a paper doesn't have to be good to be potentially important. Okay, we're going to start to cover some of these in a little bit more quickly, right? Those were three of the papers that we really needed to sort of take apart. The rest of these, with a couple of exceptions, the reading is going to be to you. The rest of them are going to be a little bit more easy to read. So I'm going to kind of leave you with them. The next one is Shoulder Anatomy, Terry et al., Journal of Athletic Training. Will Morris was the primary on this, obviously biomechanics, training, coaching, performance, and sports medicine. There's a lot in this article. I suggest you read it. It's freely available. It's very accessible. and use it with your Clemente or your Netter or your Wikipedia and get familiar with the anatomy of the shoulder. And we're going to try and select more papers like this, like functional anatomy of the knee or clinical anatomy of the knee, stuff like this to sort of, year to year review these kind of points of anatomy and physiology with you. The shoulder is a ball and socket joint. Here you see the humerus, head of the humerus in the glenoid fossa of the scapula, right? Here's the coracoid process, here's the acromion coming from the spine of the scapula, and here's the clavicle, the collarbone, coming over to make the acromioclavicular joint. The thing that I want to point out to you here is this is a ball and socket joint, and so is the hip. And they both have a fairly wide range of motion, right? They both move in multiple planes. They're both very mobile joints, but the shoulder is more so. And it's easy to see why. Among other reasons, the configuration, the ratio of the surface area that's in contact between the ball and the socket is different between the two joints. If you look at the hip joint, the acetabulum, the socket part of the joint, is wrapped around the ball, right? It's more constraining than the shoulder joint, where the ratio of surface areas in contact is much different. This is why people sublux or dislocate their shoulders all the time. Hip joints, not so much, right? A dislocated hip suggests a fairly significant transfer of energy, whereas fairly trivial things can cause people to dislocate their shoulders. So you have much more mobility around the shoulder, but because of the configuration of the glenohumeral joint, you also have more instability. That's the trade-off. So you need to stabilize this joint. There are passive stabilizers, the glenoid labrum around the socket part of the joint, and all kinds of ligaments that help hold the humerus onto the scapula, right? And you also have active stabilizers. And what do we call those? Muscles, more specifically. Good, good, yeah, good, good. Muscles. And what do we call those muscles as a group? We call them the rotator cuff, right? And here is the rotator cuff. Fairly small muscles that all insert very proximally on the humerus, right? So not big lever arms for any of these muscles. Supraspinatus muscle supposedly does that. Subscapularis muscle is in the front of your scapula between your chest wall and your shoulder blade, comes around, attaches in front. So what is it going to do? It's going to internally rotate, right? And then you have these two external rotators, supposedly do this, which is why physical therapists think that when you have rotator cuff, you need to be doing stuff like that. But they're not primary movers of the shoulder. What they are is they're active stabilizers of the shoulder. And the way they work is pretty cool. Here's your humerus. We're looking at it straight on, like this, right? This is not exactly anatomical, but you have subscapularis attaching, it's actually coming around from behind the humerus and attaching in the front there, so it's an internal rotator of the shoulder. But it's also doing something else. It's also pulling the humeral head in. Pulling the humeral head into the glenoid fossa. The external rotators, infraspinatus teres minor, rotating it out this way, but they're also pulling it in. And finally, supraspinatus supposedly doing this, but it's also pulling it in. And you can see how this configuration of muscles around the proximal humerus creates a bunch of force couples, right, to stabilize and balance the forces acting around the humeral head and cause it to track precisely in the glenoid fossa when you're moving your shoulder around. Make sense? The authors use this analogy. You got a weak kid and a strong kid, and they're trying to lift the ladder. So the weak kid sits on the proximal portion of the ladder and dynamically stabilizes it, while the strong kid, the prime mover, your deltoids, pecs, traps, that kind of thing, actually move the shoulder. That's the relationship between the rotator cuff and the primary movers of the shoulder, which suggests a good way to get your rotator cuff strong. right? Because if this kid is stronger, if this kid gets stronger and he's able to lift a heavier ladder more quickly, then this kid has to get stronger too. Does everybody understand what I'm saying? If you want to make your rotator cuff stronger, just challenge it by using the prime movers of the shoulder to lift more weight. The rotator cuff has to get stronger in churn to help stabilize the shoulder as heavier loads are being lifted. So to make your rotator cuff stronger, you don't do this. To make your rotator cuff stronger, you do this and this. And, as Carl Schut recently pointed out in a most excellent article posted on his blog, you could deadlift. That makes both the active and the passive stabilizers of the shoulder stronger. That was a really nice piece, Carl. Doggy bag, SSC should be familiar with the anatomy of the shoulder. All this stuff is in the article. You can read it. It's a good article. If you couple that with a look at Netter or Clemente or Wikipedia, you get a pretty good idea of what's going on in the shoulder joint. Next paper is Churchward, Venn et al., Protein Anabolism of Aging. Jordan Feigenbaum was the primary on this one. Here are the categories. I'm going to let you read it. It's a little bit technical. It should be accessible to all of you. You're all smart people. And it's territory that we've seen before. It's a good addition to literature, but it's stuff that we've seen before and stuff that we looked at in detail last year. Older trainees are subject to a multifactorial anabolic resistance to both training and nutrition. So they need a little bit more of both, carefully modulated. One of the most important of these factors is a relative resistance to amino acid stimulation of protein synthesis. And the answer to that is to eat more protein. Increase the dose. Because it's been shown over and over and over again that although you are resistant to the same load of protein relative to your younger training counterparts, the undeserving punks who work out with you, right? If you eat more protein than they do, you can stimulate mTOR and you can stimulate muscle protein synthesis in response to a training bout. Bottom line, older people need to eat more protein. Nikki.
How would you identify someone as being older? What is the indicator that they fit this criteria?
Yeah, we start to see these declines after the age of 35. Next paper, again, we're just going to touch on it. It's there for you to read. Again, it's somewhat technical, but it's accessible to all of you. We've talked a lot about this a little bit before. This is the paper on myokines by Brandt and Peterson. Peterson is, I believe, a Danish author who's really pioneered this whole field of the myokines. What do we mean by myokines? Myokines are signaling molecules that are elaborated by muscle tissue in response to contraction or inactivity. And the myokine profile that you'll see, the hormonal profile that you'll see elaborated by the muscle, will be different depending on how you use it. These authors point out that inflammation is a significant component in the development of chronic diseases and the diseases of aging. Inflammation appears to play a role in the development of type 2 diabetes. Inflammation appears to play a role in the development of cardiovascular disease and stroke, chronic lung disease. Inflammation is huge in the development of chronic diseases and diseases of aging. And they point out that among the many myokines that have been identified, a lot of them appear to have anti-inflammatory properties. So put that in your pipe and smoke it, read the paper, realize that this is just the tip of a very, very huge field of study, right? It's something really, really important. It turns out that muscle is the biggest gland in your body. It's an endocrine organ. It secretes hormones that have an effect upon your physiology and your health. That's enormous, right? So we may have thought that we were kind of like specializing in the development of a tissue that helped you pick heavy things up and put them down again and hold your back stable, but we're also training a gland. Deal with that. Read the article. There's a lot in there, more than we have time to cover today. Neuromuscular efficiency, I could talk about this paper all day. It was on the website. So maybe you didn't necessarily read the articles that the science committee brought to you, but if you aren't reading the articles on the website, come on, right? So I hope you all read this article. This was a really, really substantial contribution by CJ to our database on neuromuscular efficiency. I could talk about it for a long time. I'm just going to highlight some of it for you. Neuromuscular efficiency, as you know, depends heavily on genetic endowment, but is subject somewhat to training effects. CJ talks about forced time curves, which are the laboratory standard, but again, vertical jump is the applicable field test for neuromuscular efficiency and innate explosiveness in athletes. High neuromuscular efficiency equals the genetic plus trained capacity to quickly and efficiently recruit motor units and efficiently rate code motor units into a movement pattern, right? I don't think CJ specifically talks about the size principle as such, but I mean, you talk about it, but you don't call it the size principle, right? The ability to go from low-powered motor units, right, at the start of a movement pattern and then very, very quickly exhaust all the low-power motor units and quickly move into the high-power motor units, right? To overcome the size principle. The size principle says that small motor fibers and small low-powered motor units are recruited into a movement pattern before the big high-powered motor units are recruited into a movement pattern. And this is an area where training can help. We can't increase the ratio of your high-powered motor units to your low-power motor units because that's genetically determined. But what we can do is increase your capacity to rapidly contribute, to rapidly get to and recruit the high-powered motor units that you do have into that motor pattern. Make sense? There is a lot in this article. You should all go in and read it at least 3 times. Very important. Finally, he makes the point that you shouldn't do Fran during your novice progression. She'll wait for you if she really loves you. Muscle and health and disease, again, we're just going to touch on it. Nice paper by Wolf. This one belongs in your file, so you can whip it out, hand it to clients, hand it to doctors, hand it to policymakers and politicians. Muscle protein has a central role in whole-body metabolism and survival. It has a role in the maintenance of serum amino acid and glucose levels. It's a big reservoir for carbon skeletons that you can use to maintain your serum glucose. In starvation, the inability to extract carbon skeletons from muscle tissue is the imminent harbinger of death. If you are starving to death, he talks about studies of people in the Warsaw Ghetto during the war. If you are starving to death, right, and you're wasting away, the physiological harbinger of your imminent demise is you suddenly lose the capacity to extract any more carbon skeletons, amino acids, from your muscle tissue. When you have depleted your ability to do that, that's when you die. That is the proximal event to death in starvation. Muscle mass predicts survival from critical illness and injury. And anybody who's ever spent any time in an ICU, any kind of critical care unit, there's no doubt in our mind that that is true, right? People who are sarcopenic, people who are obese and sarcopenic, they're not survivors. People who are robust, athletic, muscular, they either survive or they take longer to die, right? It's a trade-off in everything. The development of insulin resistance appears to occur in metabolic syndrome through several muscle-dependent processes. We've talked about some of these before. I've tended to focus in the past on the role of the glucose transporter. These guys are talking about the accumulation of triglyceride or fat in muscle and how it can disrupt insulin sensitivity. An increase in muscle mass can lead to a difference of up to 200 kilocalories per day in caloric expenditure, assuming constant turnover, meaning you're training. Muscle mass and osteoporosis, they talk about, that's old news. And finally, the author says that the current dietary recommendations that we use in this country are completely inadequate to the needs of muscle tissue in health and disease. They do not reflect the importance of muscle and muscle protein in health and disease. So kind of the same message that we just saw. People need to eat more protein. Physical function and aging, this one's by Mary Conover. I've had the opportunity to work with Mary a little bit in the last couple of months. Mary Conover has done a lot of work with RIP in the past, indexing the books. She's written this very fine article for our site. She has, I believe, a Bachelor of Science in Nursing, and she's written several widely used textbooks on EKG interpretation and made other important contributions to the literature. She's the real deal. This paper falls in the category of muscle physiology and big medicine. And again, it's familiar but important territory. She talks about the role of aging mitochondria, which is a huge deal in aging biology. Mitochondria get old, they get decrepit, they become less able to handle free radicals, they become more able to make free radicals, which are damaging to cells. They make it a little bit more difficult and inefficient for cells to handle energy metabolism. They seem to be directly involved in cell suicide processes that can lead to atrophy. She also talks about the change in muscle fiber types that we see with aging, an increasing predominance of type 1 fibers over type 2 fibers, when the type 2 fibers are the ones that you really need as you get older, and so on. She talks a little bit about O2 delivery, consumption, and mismatch. I'll let you read that. That kind of was a new way of thinking for me. Blunted recovery capacity that you know about, bone strength, and she talks about some important implications for training of masters. Strength in public health. This is another potentially important article that probably belongs in your files for distribution to physicians and clients. Sima Park was the primary reviewer on this. And here's the take-home points. The author is talking about what he calls a dogmatic dichotomy between endurance or aerobic training with long, slow distance training and an undervalued resistance training component. Basically, the author of this paper, this implicit literature review, is saying we probably have really undervalued resistance training as part of the exercise prescription for aging populations. And we don't really understand it. Now, as it turns out, the author doesn't really understand it either, right? But at least he's asking the question. And so what do you get? You get these kinds of recommendations, right? This is, so endurance is first, then balance, then strength, then flexibility. These are the exercises that old people should be doing to hit all these broad domains. And I think we all know this is just going to lead to a lot of pain and suffering for everybody, right? There's just nothing good that's going to come out of that. So this author talks about the impact of resistance training on cardiovascular health, obesity, type 2 diabetes, mobility, osteopenia, osteoporosis, even cancer, neurodegeneration, rehabilitation, all the stuff that we've talked about, all the stuff you know. So it's one more paper that goes in your files. But after all that, and after pointing out that the research on resistance training is messed up, the authors still get it wrong. And that's a critical observation. They still get it wrong. They still come up with a completely screwed up prescription for resistance training in aging populations, right? The use of rating the perceived exertion and other subjective outcomes, sets per muscle group. They're actually talking about sets per muscle group, and effort to failure, and all this other wacky stuff, right? So they go from a recognition that resistance training for strength is important in an aging population, and they still get to the wrong prescription. That is a chronic issue, a classic issue that we're seeing now, and some of us are trying to do something about it. Exercise is medicine. That's become almost a truism. It's like old hat. But if exercise is a medicine, it has to be properly prescribed. If resistance training is a medicine, it has to be properly prescribed. And you have to know what you're talking about before you prescribe it. So these authors, they're basically in the same boat as this lady, right? She knows she should be doing something, right? She should be getting strong, but had no idea how to go about it. So we love to look at this kind of stuff and laugh, but you know, we all see people in the gym who are doing weird shit, right? At least they know they should be getting strong. But unfortunately, people don't know how to do it. And by people, I mean also physicians, policymakers, physical therapists, right? So that is part of our mission. That is part of our mission, to show people the right way to do it. I have a lot of work to do.